get into my presentation. My name is Nicole Leidl, and as Shelley said, I am the Museum Associate here at the MAG. I was also the lead curator for our exhibit about the Chamber of Commerce for Progress and Development, which is currently on display in Gallery 2. So I've prepared a short presentation for you guys about the men that took the initiative to begin the Board of Trade 130 years ago. I began researching the Red Deer Board of Trade just before the Christmas holidays last year by reading through several local history books. But the bulk of my research consisted of reading through old newspaper articles on newspapers.com. I started in 1904, which was the earliest year on record, and read nearly every article I could find about the Board of Trade. I began to make a membership list and a timeline of events, and that became the basis of the exhibit that's in the galleries now. I also looked through the Chamber of Commerce fonds at the Red Deer and District Archives and went to the Chamber of Commerce offices to look through their files as well so that I could collect as comprehensive a story as possible to tell in this exhibit. If you have already had a chance to see the exhibit, you'll know that we've told the story of the Board of Trade and the Chamber of Commerce through broad themes of their work over the last 130 years. But the thing that I wasn't able to share in the exhibit was the people that made up this wonderful organization. Through the course of my research, I found hundreds of names of members, presidents, executives, committee chairmen, general members, junior members, all of them. And I learned many of their histories. Obviously, that's way too many people to talk about tonight, so I decided that I would focus on the original 12. But I can say that all of the members here in this organization were men of marked ability and public spirit, just like this quotation from the Alberta Advocate had to say in 1906. So the Red Deer Board of Trade held their inaugural meeting on March 17th, 1894, inside the Saskatchewan Land and Homestead Company offices on Ross Street.
Which you can actually see right behind you.
Which you can see behind us in Heritage Square. We call it the Stevenson Hall Block, and it's actually the oldest surviving building in the city. The 12 prominent men in the community were present at that first meeting, and over the course of that first year, over 30 men became paying members of the board. I was only able to find photos for about half the group from the Red Deer Archives. So in the upper left corner, we have George Wellington Green. Below him is Francis Edward Wilkins. Robert Cutsworth Brumpton is beside, then George Wilbert Smith. Raymond Leonard Gates is up in the top right corner, and under that is William Piper. I found that the occupations of these men were very interesting and telling of the makeup of the community at the time. The first residents came to Red Deer in the mid-1880s, including several of these men. Of the 12, 7 were businessmen. Brumpton, Birch, Gates, and Pigeon all owned general stores. Jackson was a hotel proprietor. Murphy was the publisher of the Red Deer Review newspaper, and Piper owned a brick manufacturing business. J.S. Hicks was one of the first medical doctors in the district, and R.N. Pardue was the first veterinarian. George W. Green was the first lawyer in Red Deer, and Francis E. Wilkins was one of the first notaries. And George W. Smith was the first teacher in the Red Deer Public School District number 104. And one of the things that I found interesting, but in hindsight really shouldn't have been surprising, was the high amount of crossover between the Board of Trade and Town and City Council. The names that are highlighted in blue, with the exception of George Wilbert Smith, were all on the first Red Deer Town Council. As membership increased for the board, it wasn't uncommon to have nearly identical boards of trade and town or city councils. So in many instances that I found, it was really the Board of Trade members petitioning to their own members in the capacity of town council to support motions that they had just voted on several days before. So here is the first town council in 1901 and the first city council in 1913. And here are the members of the Board of Trade. I guess that Elsie Fulmer really didn't get the memo that he was supposed to be a board member. So with all that crossover, it also wasn't uncommon to have Board of Trade members become the mayor. Of that original 12, both R.L. Gates and G.W. Smith were former mayors. Gates was the first mayor of the town of Red Deer in 1901, and G.W. Smith was the mayor of the city of Red Deer from 1916 to 1918. And as far as I can tell, all 8 town mayors, 17 of 27 city mayors, and 6 of 14 reeves or mayors of North Red Deer were all members of the Board of Trade. So town and city council members weren't the only side quests that I took while I was researching for the Board of Trade. I also really got stuck on the Gates family rabbit hole because there were just so many Gateses that kept popping up on both town and city council and on the Board of Trade, and I needed to be able to keep track of everyone. So I ended up making a family tree to figure out how exactly they were related to Reverend Leonard Gates. So using newspapers.com, Find a Grave, and other ancestry websites, I was able to create a family tree with over 200 direct descendants of Leonard Gates. So obviously that would not fit on the PowerPoint, so I have made a condensed version with just Leonard Gates's 11 children and their spouses. And I'll just tell you a little bit about the men in the group because they were the ones that were on the board. So Raymond Leonard Gates, the eldest son, owned the trading post at the Red Deer Crossing. He was also a co-owner of Smith & Gates Hardware with G.W. Smith and Brumpton & Gates with R.C. Brumpton. The second son, Haley Hamilton Gates, was the 4th mayor of Red Deer. He was a co-owner in the Gates Cornett Drug and Book Company with Roy G. Cornett, and he was also a professor of pharmaceutical sciences and the dean of pharmacy at the University of Alberta. Clarence Wilberforce Gates, the 3rd son, was the first mayor in Leduc in 1906, and I have recently learned that his 1910 Victorian brick mansion is up for sale in Leduc, if anyone's interested. George Wilbert Smith was the first teacher of the Red Deer Public School District number 104, like I said. He was also an owner of Smith & Gates with R.L. Gates. He was the 11th mayor of Red Deer, and he was also a Liberal MP for Red Deer from 1921 to 1931. Next up are the twins, James Ferrier and Frederick Warren Gates, who were local managers and agents of the North Alberta Land Company. Next up is Hugh Clark. He was a local contractor in Red Deer. Richard Bruce Woodsworth was a farmer and also a local contractor in Red Deer and Edmonton. William James Stevenson was a bookseller and stationer in Wetaskiwin who may have gotten his start at the Gates Cornett Drug and Book Company. Harry Wallace was a dry goods manager at Smith & Gates, and the baby Leander Moore Isaac Gates, who went by Jack, was born at the Crossing and eventually took over a men's clothing business of Pigeon and Wallace that he eventually named Gates & Company. As you can tell, there's a lot of businesses named after the Gateses, and it was hard to keep track which one of them were running which business at times. And I had to stop my little side quest into the Gateses after our collections manager, Melanie, found a whole binder of the Gates family research with a family tree and biographies in the back. So sometimes we really do reinvent the wheel without meaning to. Like I said, most of the men were on the board. I can understand why Clarence wasn't there, but he did show up to the meetings when he was visiting family in Red Deer. So of the 11, 5 sons and 5 son-in-laws were members of the Board of Trade. But there were some additional extended members of the Gates family who were also members of the board. So I have their names up in the top corners there. So 5 nephews and 1 grandson, Hugh W. Clark Jr., were members of the Board of Trade as well. And something that I found that was interesting and kind of sad, if you'll note Joseph Mitchell Smith in the upper right corner and George Wilbert Smith, who is married to Caroline. They are sons of Leonard's elder sister, Sarah Ann Gates Smith. So I'll let you put that together, what that means. But back to our original 12 people. I'll tell you a little bit about what some of these men were doing in Red Deer. So Robert Cutsworth Brumpton came to Red Deer in 1892, and he opened the Brumpton General Store on Gates Avenue with help from his brother-in-law. That business was located at 5003 50th Avenue, which is the comic book store next to Artistry in Gold. And that is the oldest wood frame building that is still standing in downtown today. And he operated his business alone until 1915 and then went into business with R.L. Gates. Next we have George Wellington Green. He was the first lawyer in Red Deer and went into business with William Ernest Payne, who also joined the Board of Trade later on. and opened the firm of Green and Payne. He became the town solicitor in 1901, and he held that position until he was transferred to Medicine Hat to be the district court's judge in 1916. Then we have William Piper, who I have recently learned is a very interesting man. He came to Red Deer from Ontario in 1891 and started up the Piper Brick Manufacturing Company at the base of Piper Mountain. And after nearly a decade of operation, he founded another brickyard in 1900, which he called the Red Deer Brick and Lumber Company. But what I just recently learned was that he had a brief stint as an undertaker. And I learned a very interesting story of what was probably his first and last customer of his undertaking business. And if you don't mind, I'll share it with you. It is a bit gruesome. He met this lady called, her name was Mrs. Upton, and unfortunately her husband had passed away. And she called Mr. Piper out to her homestead to bury her husband. And then that afternoon she said, "I'm going to the United States now. My husband was the American soldier. I'm going to go collect my widow's pension. Bye-bye." But when she got to the United States, they told her that she wasn't allowed to get her widow's pension unless her husband was buried in a soldier's grave in the United States, and she had to live there. So she came back to Red Deer and made preparations to sell her homestead. And that took nearly a year. And after that was all sorted out, she called Mr. Piper back and asked if he could exhume her husband's body so that she could take him to the United States. She had ordered a metal coffin to transport him in. And when they pulled up the grave, they noticed that the coffin for Mr. Upton was a foot longer than the metal coffin that they had ordered. So they decided they were going to cut 1 foot off the wood coffin and accidentally took 3. They got 1 foot of pine board and 2 of Mr. Upton's. So they gave Mr. Upton back his feet, popped him in his new metal coffin, and put him in the cart they were going to take to the United States. And that took up all the room there was. So unfortunately, Mrs. Upton's son rode a horse, and it sounds like she sat on top of the coffin all the way on their trip, which is a little unfortunate for everyone involved. Another tragic story belongs to Francis Edward Wilkins. He came to Red Deer from St. Louis in 1889 on a hunting trip, and just liked the area so much, he decided that he was going to stay. He was an early notary public and was a conveyancer, which means he was a lawyer who specialized in real estate. And then he established the Blindman River Electric Power Company with his brother George in 1904. The company quickly gained some large contracts to deliver electric power to Red Deer, Black Falls, and Lacombe. But unfortunately, there was unreliable water supply in the Blindman River, and they had a perpetually leaky dam. So business wasn't super great. And then, unfortunately, his brother George passed away, and a few months later, Francis was found dead in the offices in Lacombe from a self-inflicted bullet wound. So not all of the stories I've been finding have been quite so entertaining. They've been entertaining, but they've been morbid. But beyond all that, these men had some great hopes and dreams for Red Deer, which is why they thought to establish the Board of Trade in the first place. After their first meeting on March 17th, the group reconvened on March 23rd, where they signed the Constitution that had been drafted. And I really feel that this Constitution, which is on the screen here, was followed through on the thousands of objectives that have been undertaken by this organization in the past 130 years. So at those first meetings in March and April of 1894, 3 objectives were brought forward by the board that they wanted to accomplish first. Firstly, and most importantly to the board, was to get Red Deer incorporated as a hamlet. R.M. Pardue, the veterinarian, was selected to be the first overseer of the hamlet, and a tax rate was set at 2 sawmills. The second goal was to find a location to use as a community cemetery, and from Mr. Piper's story, I think we can see why we needed a special place to put all of our deceased members. And thirdly, the Board of Trade was endeavoring to save the Red Deer Review newspaper that their member, D.H. Murphy, had just started. It was very important for these men to get news from the district and from around Canada to members who lived here, so they weren't so isolated in the community. But unfortunately, Mr. Murphy's newspaper folded in April of that year after being in print for only 1 month. And I came across this quotation last week while I was preparing this presentation, and I really think it just wraps up everything perfectly. I've learned so much about Red Deer while I was researching for this exhibit, and have really grown to appreciate our community and the Board of Trade and Chamber of Commerce much more because of it. So before we close out the evening here, I do have one more thing I'd like to share with you. Taylor, our Visitor Services Associate, who's standing in the back of the room here, has created a little video for us. I found lots of really interesting newspaper articles, comments from members of the Board of Trade or about the Board of Trade in the newspaper. We had a little hit wall kind of behind my desk of all these comical newspaper articles, and we thought it'd be really funny if we turned them into tweets and see what it would look like. So Taylor has taken these tweets for us, has created them all, and then has turned them into a video where we've put voiceover on them so that the tweets can speak for themselves. Most of these are verbatim from the newspaper. Some of them have been paraphrased a little bit, but for the most part, this is what was in print in the newspaper. So I'll play that video for now, and I hope you enjoy.
I was on the Red Deer Board of Trade for 13 years. Here's why I think no one is interested in the board anymore. A thread. The board meetings are basically just for smoking. Those who aren't into that, and there are a few, either suffer or leave early. Admittedly, most meetings in Red Deer are like this though. I, and others, don't enjoy 2 to 3 hour meetings where the atmosphere is so small occasion I smoke myself in a board almost any time to concentrate although its musicians and side note if we do want I have a killer playlist I can offer.
Isn't it about time something was done by the Board of Trade to get the publicity building in shape for an exhibit? Very soon winter will be here and the exhibit will be of little value until next year. Get a move on, gentlemen.
We have been instructed to thank Dr. McIntyre for his attempt to secure Red Deer as a port of entry. Last week he secured the same privilege for Wetaskiwin without their thanks, and, seeing as he failed to do so for Red Deer, we are unsure what we have to be thankful for. However, we are always thankful for small favors and hope that a time will come when Red Deer is appreciated. Second, and I say this with all the love and friendship in my heart, the Board of Trade is made up of the same guys year after year. I get it, we want to elect officers that have the most experience and the best connections, but what if, and hear me out on this, we're missing out on some great ideas by not being more open-minded when it comes to elections. It's not always those who speak the oftenest or make the most noise at a meeting that make the best workers.
Didn't you say you served on the board for 13 years?
Held a meeting last Tuesday about daylight savings. We heard it would interfere with farming. Current day is 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. and this would cut it down. It would make catching buses hard for rural kids. Kids would lose out on an hour of sleep, which would affect studies. Teachers in west-facing classrooms with no air conditioning like that, it will make their rooms cooler. It would benefit few and cause inconvenience to many others. However, only 20 people showed up. It would appear we had a majority vote against by a minority of persons. Hey Board of Trade, apparently I'm on the Railway Committee. This is the first I'm hearing of it. There you are, you've already missed 3 meetings. If we have a strong secretary/commissioner/president, we should be able to add new faces and ideas to our committee. Third of all, we only held 4 meetings last year, with the occasional special meeting when needed. So, when the executive shared their reports with us, the info was already 3 months old by the time it got to us. Some of the items they brought up had already been acquitted before we had even heard of them. How I looked trying to breathe calmly in the smoky meeting room. So all the board had to do was approve what the executive had already done, have a smoke, with no music to accompany, mind you, and go home. No wonder people think the Board of Trade is useless. Breaking news, our enterprising neighbor has fallen victim to the prevailing delusion that a bigger name means bigger and better business. Even though Chamber has more letters than Board and Commerce sounds more classy than Trade, they mean exactly the same thing. Back in the day nobody would have thought of calling such an organization a Chamber of Commerce. The boardroom was small and the only chamber we heard about was an Etruscan jar of artistic design which had been dug out of some Italian ruins. Calgary has a Board of Trade, because that city sprang up from grassroots and it doesn't need any high-sounding name change to dignify and show its worth. Edmonton is a chamber of commerce, which would have caused Frank Oliver to turn over in his grave if he heard the new name. Changing Board of Trade to Chamber of Commerce, as Red Deer has done, gives the impression that our enterprising neighbor is trying to put on a better front, rather than depending on its own intrinsic worth as a first-rate town. That is the trouble with those places that are growing rapidly in population. They think that they are cities, when they are only large towns. Some of their citizens get too big for their britches. Example, the baseball officials at Red Deer who claimed that one of the reasons they left the Central Alberta League was that Clive had a cow pasture for a baseball diamond. Clive is one of the best teams in the league. We're all friends together in Central Alberta. Clive is just as good as Red Deer or Stettler. The size of a town makes no difference, but what it is doing for the community in which it is located is the chief reason for its existence. Congratulations to Constable William Howarth and Constable Bob Bennett on another successful arrest. Mr. and Mrs. Wayne McFeeder of Dodge City, Kansas, were arrested Friday just south of the city. They are this weekend's guests of Red Deer and will receive a free trailer space at Lion Trailer Park, as well as a number of goodies from local businesses. Is there a reason why regular members of the board can't go to executive meetings? Not to discuss, but just to listen and actually know what our officers are doing without having to wait 3 months for a general meeting? The Board of Trade is funded by our taxes and subscriptions. Therefore, we should have the privilege of knowing what's going on before the info is 3 months old. Anyways, those are my thoughts on the Board of Trade. I'm probably wasting my time here, but if nothing else, I hope this convinces the Board of Trade to at least cut down on the smoking. I see you all enough at meetings, I don't want to see you at my work too. Contest time. We're partnering with Quaker Flour Company to find a new slogan for Red Deer. The winner will receive a 98-pound sack of flour all their own. Please submit using hashtag slogan for Red Deer no later than November 30th, 1929. A slick slogan for Red Deer, a hamlet called a city in the hollow of the hills. Come and visit Red Deer and know the reason why. It's a high town to live in and a dear one to die. There's taxes, lights, and eats, costs us more and more every day. Then take the quickest route, boys, and hike far away. We farmers are proud of Red Deer and are glad to see any improvements that can make it a nice, clean city, but when Board of Trade passes laws that keep farmers off the front streets and makes us hitch our horses in the back alley, knowing full well that there is nowhere in town to tie a horse, except someone's fence or telephone pole, then where do we go? Such a law is an insult to farmers and a detriment to the town. Every businessman depends on farmers for bread and butter, but if we are not needed anymore we will gently kiss you all goodbye. There are plenty of towns that will be glad to get our trade and we can hitch our teams where we like. I am ashamed to see such a beggarly sample of grain such as was sent by Board of Trade to Halifax Fair. It was poor and mildewed, and when I saw it I was ashamed for anyone to know I was from Red Deer. Not our fault. The sample was excellent when it was sent to Calgary and it was sent to Halifax after that. Reveal time. We are proud to officially reveal the new billboards that will welcome visitors to our city. There will be one each placed on the north and south ends of the city. Pictured is a number of our JC members with the new sign.
It is with deep concern that I noted through the pages of the Advocate that the suggestion has been made to the Chamber of Commerce that the elk should be made the emblem of Red Deer, instead of the deer. A member stated that what the early settlers described as a deer was really an elk. Long before white settlers came to this country, the indigenous people named the river Waskasiu, which, according to the Cree dictionary, stands for red deer or red elk. This has been handed down to us as word of mouth, and we may be mistaken in some of what we consider established facts. When the Gates family came to Red Deer in 1884, they were told by a very old Cree man that a small red deer was found along the banks of the Red Deer River. It was very tame and soon fell prey to early rum runners and adventurers and was wiped out before white settlers came in. Can anyone say definitely that the red elk or the red deer is our emblem? The deer is a graceful animal which we have always recognized and is in our schools. Why change it to the ungainly elk?
It's not clear whether the animal on our city crest is an elk or a deer, but it probably doesn't make much of a difference to tourists. There is no doubt in the world, but that Red Deer is bound to develop as a business center and distributing point. The list of inquiries read at the meetings of the board is evidence that even now the eyes of many are turned towards Red Deer. The Board of Trade will have an important part to play in this development. Cooperation by all the businessmen and others who have the welfare of the city and district at heart will do wonders. Doubtless you have noticed in the press this the week the report of the finding of a gold mine east of Red Deer. Well, all I have to say is a whole lot of farmers and businessmen of this district have their own gold mines if they only stay with it and work out the gold shekels.